One more game to show against Benkő, and we've seen several games against Benkő already. You'll recall that Benkő was born in France. His parents were vacationing when he was born on July 15th, 1928. Benkő learned chess from his dad at the age of 10, and he won the Hungarian Chess Championship in 1948. Benkő became an international master in 1950, and after beginning his chess career in Hungary, he defected to the United States on October 17th, 1957. The following year, 1958, he tied for third and fourth place at the Portoros Interzonal with 12.5 points, and that's what qualified him as a grandmaster and gave him the right to play in this tournament. Benkő won or tied first at the United States Open 8 different times. He is a U.S. Chess Hall of Fame inductee as of 1993, but his biggest claim to fame, in my opinion, and his greatest chess achievement, in my opinion, and since I'm the one doing the show, at the moment, mine is the only opinion that matters. But in 1970, he qualified to play at Palma de Mallorca in the Interzonal, but he gave up his seat for Bobby Fischer. Don't miss this. Benkő qualified to play in the Interzonal. That's the tournament that you go to see if you can make it to the candidates, and then the candidates is what you go to see if you can challenge the world champion. Well, that particular cycle, the Interzonal tournament led to candidates matches, elimination matches, and then the winner would go on to play the world champion. Benkő gave up his seat at the Interzonal to Bobby Fischer. And as we all know, Bobby Fischer won the Interzonal by 3.5 points that year, destroying his opponents. And then he went on and destroyed his opponents in the candidates matches. He beat Mark Taimanov 6-0. He beat Bent Larsen 6-0. He beat Tigran Petrosian 11-2. And then he went on to win the world championship against Boris Spassky in 1972. So, Benkő was everybody's pal for giving up his seat and allowing Bobby Fischer to go on and become world champion. Benkő died in Budapest, August 25th, 2019. A true chess hero, if you ask me. Let's go on. So we have e4 and c6, the Caro-Kann defense. Knight c3, d5. Bobby always with the two knights attack when he played against the Caro-Kann, and this is no exception. Knight f3. Bishop g4 is Mindeno's variation. h3 and bishop takes knight is the exchange line. Queen takes bishop, knight f6. Pawn d3, pawn e6, now pawn g3. And here, the book move is bishop d2. That's answered by queen's knight to d7, g4, and the most common response to g4 is pawn h6. In this game, Bobby with g3. Bishop b4, pinning the knight. Bishop d2, breaking the pin. You can castle in this line to the queen's side, but we're going to see Bobby kingside castle in this game. But yes, queenside castles is a line that can be played. Pawn d4 here, hitting the knight. Knight back to b1. Queen b6, pawn b3, and now pawn a5. That gets a star. I'm a little surprised by this. In my opinion, the better move is to develop your last knight to d7. Let's see what I get for this. A check mark. Benko's move being marked as the best move. But in my opinion, developing is fundamentally the best move here, at our level at least. a5 was played by Benkő. a3 hits that bishop, and as you can see, the queen side is starting to get busted up quite a bit here, so we will not see queenside castles after all. Not in this game. Bishop takes the bishop with check, knight takes the bishop, and queen c5. I thought black looked slightly better, but looking at the eval bar, it's pretty even. Queen d1 defends the c-man. Pawn h5. Pawn h4. Queen's knight to d7 is played here. And he played bishop to g2. I'm not a big fan of bishop g2. The diagonal is blunted, and you do have a pawn in your own way, although it could theoretically move forward at the moment. Bot calling for bishop e2. I preferred bishop h3. Bishop h3 for me. Let's see what I get. A check mark. Bobby with bishop g2. Knight g4. Now the kingside castle. Pawn g5. Looking to break the castle open already. Now, by the way, with this hole on c3, it might be worth looking at queen to c3. Let's see what we get. A check mark. I did get one brilliancy earlier tonight, but they are few and far between this week, aren't they? Instead, g5 from Benkő, and b4 hits the queen. Queen retreats to e7. Don't take that pawn. Do not play pawn takes pawn here. On pawn takes the pawn, pawn takes the pawn, rook must take the rook. And on queen takes the rook, you're looking pretty gem dandy. Note, queen takes rook is much better than pawn takes queen. Do not play pawn takes queen here and allow rook takes queen. You get something like so. That is favoring black. So queen takes the rook in that line is the best move. And of course, we're threatening to skewer the king and the rook. Benkő with queen e7 right here. Knight f3 is played. Pawn takes the pawn. Knight takes the pawn. Queen's knight to e5. Again here, do not play pawn takes pawn here. On pawn takes pawn and pawn takes the pawn. This time black will play kingside castles. And okay, you have bishop h3. White has a bit of an advantage here. This super attack puts him in a pretty good position. And so knight d e5. Queen d2, right here, play pawn takes pawn first. Play this move first, and then queen e2 later. Bobby playing queen e2 straight away. Excuse me, queen d2. Rook g8. And speaking of playing things first, it would be prudent to play pawn a4 first and save this move for later. And the reason is I want to avoid pawn takes pawn if I'm black, or at least I should want to. Benkő with rook g8, but surprisingly, Bobby does not play pawn takes pawn. He plays queen f4, marked inaccurate. Pawn takes pawn should have been played, and after knight g6 and knight takes the knight, rook takes the knight, and then we probably have to play bishop f3 here, maybe get over. So Bobby did not play pawn takes the pawn. Bit of a surprise. Instead, queen f4 from Fischer. Now f6 was played. That is marked as a mistake. The bot calling for knight g6. I like queen d6. I like this idea. Okay, he has the same idea of getting in line with the opponent's queen. Now again, I do not want to play pawn takes pawn here. On pawn takes pawn, rook takes rook is compelled. And that puts white in a pretty good position. f6 was tried by Benkő. And now pawn takes a5. Finally played, rook takes a5. King's rook to b1. a4 being called for. The idea of a4 is to prevent this pawn from coming to b5. Bobby with king's rook b1, and b5 is in fact played. Knight f3, rook a4, defending the pawn, bishop h3. Knight takes knight is check, queen takes the knight. King d7, questioned, rook g5 preferred. Perhaps queen g7 could have been well played. Let's see, I get a star. Benkő with king to d7, Bobby with king g2. It gets a big red X. Understand the purpose of king g2. The purpose of king g2 is to get the king off of g1 so that after the knight works its way to f3, there's no check. We'll look at that later, but perhaps rook b4 is more appropriate here. But king g2 was played, and then queen g7. Okay, so king c7 should be considered so that no check can be delivered on the d file. Avoid the check on the d file. So, for example, if I play rook b4 and my opponent retreats his rook, well, with the king not on d7, this is not check. If it were check, then the king would have to move. But since it's not check, this can't really be taken because c5 can now be played because it's not check. He doesn't have to get his king out of check. And that, as you can see, traps the rook. Every square covered to which the rook can flee. So that's why king c7 is preferred. It's preferred in a prophylactic way, just like king g2 is a prophylactic. Well, queen g7 was played, and rook b4 is played. Now the king's rook comes to the a8 square, and rook takes rook is a huge threat now because this pawn becomes pinned by the rarewood rook. If rook takes rook, pawn cannot take rook without this rook taking the rook on a1. But now I want to come back to the point of king g2 back here. This is where we really can see it come into play. Let's suppose that he had played knight to e5. Well, this doesn't make any sense now that the king is not on g1, but we're offering a supposition for a moment. We understand this is not the optimal move, but if the king were on g1, it would be quite effective, wouldn't it? Well, my point is now after rook takes the rook, if the king is still on g1, then knight take, and look, I get a double exclam. The point is if the king's on g1, then knight takes the queen would have been check. But since king played to g2, that's not check. And since it's not check, I can play rook a7 skewer. That's my point. And get back my stuff. And I'm up a bishop. So coming all the way back, that was the whole point of king g2, even though it got a big red X. I hope that explanation made sense. All right, so king's rook to a8 was played. And the reason it was played is because king g2 precludes the knight move. So rook takes the rook has to be played. Again, any other move. Let's do a nothing move, and you lose your rook. So rook takes rook is compelled. Rook takes the rook. Bishop takes the knight. Pawn takes the bishop. Of course, that hits the queen and brings us to a queen-rook versus queen-rook endgame. Queen to f4. How does black prevent queen to b8? Well, he does it with rook a8, dropping back. Marked inaccurate by the fickle bot, but, oh, I see. The bot says just push the pawn. That'll prevent queen b8. Okay. Actually, that does make sense, doesn't it? Rook h1 here. Rook g8. Ah, yes. c5 back. The c5 makes way for the king here, and that should keep the table pretty level. Rook g8 from Benkő. Now a4. Threatening to take that pawn. Can't let that happen. So pawn takes the pawn. What about rook a8? Yeah, rook a8 is called for by the bot. You see, the good thing about rook a8 is now the pawn can't come to a5. It cannot play to a5. Well, it gets a check mark, but the point now is after queen g6 and rook h6, after pawn e5 hitting my queen, if that rook is here and I take, then I'm winning his rook. That's what I was trying to get at. Well, that was not played. Pawn takes the pawn was played. And look at the eval bar. Lunge in white's favor. Rook b1. Threatening to skewer the king and the queen. e5 hits the queen. Rook b7 goes ahead with the skewer. King d6. And actually, this illustrates my earlier point. Rook takes queen, and if you take my queen, I'm a rook ahead. So a perfect illustration of what I was showing before, only what actually happened. Well, pawn did take the queen, and rook did take the rook. Pawn came to f3 with check, king to h1, king to c5. I don't even know why he's still playing, but after rook b8, Benkő finally resigned.